You've felt it for a long time, that quiet sense that something in your life keeps circling back to the same emotional place. The faces may change, the circumstances may shift, but the feeling underneath has remained strangely familiar. And for so long you assumed it meant you were stuck or blocked or somehow failing to move forward. But what you're beginning to see now is far more subtle and far more powerful. You weren't stuck. You were repeating a pattern, an emotional identity, a loop created long before you ever realized you were inside it. This pattern wasn't obvious on the surface. It didn't announce itself in dramatic moments. It whispered through the small choices you made automatically, the expectations you carried without question, the reactions that felt like instinct but were really memory. It shaped the way you interpreted people. It shaped the way you interpreted yourself. And because consciousness evolves through familiarity, your mind kept recreating what it already understood, not because you deserved repetition, but because repetition felt safe. Every day, without even noticing, you stepped into that same emotional rhythm. You felt the same fears when something new appeared. You felt the same hesitation when possibility opened. You felt the same doubts at the edge of change. And because those emotions were familiar, your system looped back to them, almost like a gravitational pull. You didn't realize that this internal consistency was building an external consistency all around you, that the identity you carried silently was echoing into your timeline, calling forward situations that matched the frequency of who you believed yourself to be. But something in you is different now. The moment you started watching this, the moment something in your awareness softened enough to truly look at your life, the loop began to loosen. You're starting to see the pattern instead of just living it, and that simple shift, awareness, creates a crack in the repetition, because a loop can only continue when you are inside it unconsciously. The moment you recognize it, you're no longer fully inside. You're observing it from a slight distance, and that distance is powerful. It means the pattern has been interrupted. You may notice memories rising. You may notice situations replaying in your mind. You may even notice emotions you thought you had moved past resurfacing with a new kind of clarity. This isn't regression. It's revelation. You're seeing the architecture of the loop. You're watching how it formed, how it fed itself, how it kept you moving along the same emotional track. And even though you haven't broken it yet, you've already shifted your position within it. You're no longer the identity the loop depends on. What's happening in you right now is the beginning of liberation, the beginning of stepping out of the cycle you once mistook for fate. And as you keep listening, as you let your awareness expand, the loop will continue to weaken. You don't have to fight it, you don't have to force anything. Recognition alone begins the unraveling, because the moment you see the pattern clearly, it loses the power to disguise itself as your life. And in that moment, even before anything changes on the outside, your reality has already started to move. You've begun to notice that the pattern you lived inside wasn't only shaping your inner world, it was shaping everything around you, because reality doesn't form from what you want, it forms from what you expect. And expectation is born from identity, the emotional self you return to over and over again. That self broadcasts a signal into the field, and the field responds by arranging life around that signal, not as punishment, not as limitation, but as resonance. Your loop has been doing exactly that. Every time you unconsciously return to the same emotional baseline, you were sending out a frequency that told reality, this is who I am, this is what I know, this is what I'm prepared to experience. And reality simply echoed it back. People mirrored the same lessons. Opportunities carried the same flavor. Even misunderstandings repeated themselves with uncanny familiarity. Not because your life was stuck, but because your projection was consistent. When you look back, you can trace it. The situations that seemed unconnected, yet somehow held the same emotional signature. The relationships that dissolved for similar reasons. The goals that couldn't unfold because you were still broadcasting the version of you who didn't believe they were possible. And as you start to see this with clarity, you recognize something profound. Nothing was random. Nothing was accidental. Your timeline wasn't chaotic, it was coherent, matching the loop you carried without question. This realization isn't meant to make you feel responsible for every difficulty you've lived. It's meant to show you your power, because if your identity has been shaping your timeline this entire time, then the moment that identity shifts, your timeline must shift with it. That means your future isn't fixed. It's responsive. It's plastic. It's influenced by the frequency you stand in, not the circumstances you remember. And the loop you've been repeating has been the architect of the reality you've been navigating. Now that you're aware of the mechanism, something fundamental begins to change. The loop can't operate unconsciously anymore. You start noticing the moments when the same emotion rises before the same event occurs. You start recognizing the narratives that once felt automatic, and with that awareness, you begin to feel a soft space opening between who you truly are and the identity the loop trained you to be. In that space, the projection weakens, the timeline wavers, the repetition loses its inevitability. This is the beginning of choice, real choice, not forced action, not discipline, not effort. Choice born from seeing clearly. Choice born from understanding that your reality isn't created by the world around you, but by the self you bring to that world. And as that self evolves, the external must follow. The moment you acknowledge this, the loop's control begins to dissolve. If this clarity is opening something in you, if you feel the shift of recognition, take a moment and subscribe. These teachings meet you at the exact frequency you're stepping into, and staying connected will help you deepen what's beginning here. You're not learning how reality works, you're remembering. There have been moments lately when you felt unlike yourself. Moments where your emotions shifted without explanation, where your thoughts felt slightly out of rhythm, where something inside you seemed to stir without a clear cause. At the time, it may have felt like confusion, like restlessness, or even like something was off. But now you're beginning to understand that these sensations weren't signs of something going wrong. They were signs of something loosening. When a loop begins to destabilize, the first place it shows is within your emotional field. You start feeling things you can't name. You sense a subtle tension, as if you're standing between two versions of yourself. The familiar emotions that once felt solid begin to thin out, as though your system can't quite hold them in the same way anymore. You may have found yourself pulled between wanting change and wanting comfort, caught in a quiet push and pull you couldn't define. That internal wobble was the first crack in the pattern. You might recall days when you felt unexpectedly tired, not from physical exhaustion, but from an internal weight that didn't match your circumstances. You might remember waking up with a vague sense that something had shifted, even though your life looked the same. You may have felt disoriented, like you were watching your own reactions from a slight distance. All of these sensations were signals. They were invitations. Your consciousness was preparing for a transition, even before your mind understood what was happening. And then there were the moments that felt like emotional echoes, feelings rising that didn't belong to the present moment. Old fears, old desires, old habits surfacing without warning. These weren't regressions. They were the loop replaying itself more loudly because it could sense its own weakening. Patterns flare before they dissolve. The loop was tightening its grip not to trap you, but because its structure was beginning to collapse and it was trying to maintain its familiar rhythm. As uncomfortable as these sensations may have been, they were actually signs of awakening. The confusion wasn't a problem. It was evidence that your inner system was rearranging itself. The emotions that felt out of place were showing you that your identity was no longer fully aligned with the pattern you once repeated without question. When your consciousness grows beyond an old framework, the framework shakes, it trembles, it vibrates, and that vibration is what you've been feeling. Now, as you look back on those moments, a quiet recognition forms. You realize that nothing was wrong with you. You weren't losing control. You weren't slipping backward. You were beginning to step into a reality where the loop could no longer operate the same way. And your body, your emotions, your field, they all felt it before you could name it. This understanding brings relief because it reveals the truth. The shift didn't begin with action. It began with sensation. Your system knew before you did that the old pattern was ending. And now, you are simply catching up to what your deeper self already initiated. There have been moments in your life when time didn't behave the way it usually does. Moments where everything seemed to slow down or pause or empty itself out for just a breath. These weren't dramatic events. They were subtle, almost invisible to anyone else. A sudden stillness in the middle of your day. A moment of blankness where your thoughts stalled. A strange pause in a conversation where you felt detached from what was happening. At the time, you may have brushed these experiences away as fatigue or distraction, but they were far more meaningful than you realized. These gap moments appear when your consciousness momentarily slips outside the pattern it has been cycling through. When the loop loses its grip, even for a second, time feels different because you're no longer processing reality from inside the repetition. Instead, you're observing from just beyond its edges. The familiar rhythm of your thoughts doesn't catch you in the usual way. The automatic emotional responses don't rise with their typical certainty. You feel a quiet emptiness, not as a void, but as space. Space that wasn't there before. Think back to an ordinary moment when everything suddenly felt unfamiliar, even if only for a heartbeat. Maybe you were walking somewhere you've walked 1,000 times, and suddenly it felt surreal. Maybe you were doing something routine and felt distanced from your own actions. Maybe you looked at your life and, for one brief instant, nothing made sense the way it normally does. These were not lapses. They were windows. Your inner system was stepping just far enough outside the loop to show you its boundaries. The loop relies on continuity. It repeats by keeping you emotionally and mentally synchronized with its rhythm. When you slip out of that rhythm, even momentarily, the loop cracks. It stutters. It hesitates, and in that hesitation, you experience time without the filter of the pattern. It feels hollow because the familiar emotional charge is absent. It feels paused because the narrative you usually follow has stopped generating the next moment. It feels surreal because you're perceiving reality from a vantage point the loop cannot access. These gap moments are invitations. They are the earliest signals that your consciousness is expanding beyond the identity the loop depends on. You didn't cause them consciously. They happened because the internal structure holding the pattern together has been weakening. As you grow, the loop can no longer maintain the same level of coherence. The cracks show up first in your perception of time, because time is one of the loop's primary anchors. When your identity shifts, time's flow shifts with it. What's important to understand is that these moments were not coincidences. They weren't glitches. They were evidence. Evidence that your reality was preparing to open. Evidence that your awareness was rising above the pattern's walls. Evidence that you were already beginning to step into a version of yourself who no longer fits inside the old cycle. And now, as you recall those moments with new eyes, something becomes clear. The gaps weren't interruptions in your life. They were interruptions in the loop. They were the first glimpses of freedom. There is a quiet truth your mind has been circling for years without fully landing on. The loop you've been living inside wasn't a flaw in your thinking or a weakness in your character. It was a contract your nervous system made on your behalf long before you ever understood what it was doing. A contract built from protection, not limitation. A rhythm designed to keep you safe, not small. When something in your past felt overwhelming or unpredictable or too large for the version of you who lived through it, your system created a pattern to help you survive it. And that pattern became the loop. Your nervous system doesn't speak in words. It speaks in sensations, in impulses, in familiarity. When it finds an emotional state it knows how to manage, even if it's painful, it often chooses that familiar state over an unknown one. Familiarity is safety to the body. Predictability is safety. Even repeated disappointment can feel safer than uncertain expansion. And so the system gently guides you back to what it already understands, keeping you in an emotional landscape where it believes you can endure whatever comes. This is why your loop formed. Not because you were stuck, but because your body was trying to honor the version of you who once needed protection. It was trying to maintain coherence. It was trying to keep your inner world consistent enough to feel manageable. Every repeated reaction, every patterned emotion, every instinctual tightening was an echo of that original contract. I will keep you safe by keeping things familiar. When you see this, something softens inside you. The tension between who you want to become and who you have been begins to ease. The self-blame loses its intensity because you realize you weren't resisting growth consciously. You were honoring a survival rhythm your system believed was necessary. You were following the pathway your body laid down to keep you from re-entering old pain. Your loop wasn't a prison. It was a shield. And yet, as you've grown, as your consciousness has expanded, as your inner capacity has increased, that shield began to restrict you more than it protected you. The nervous system doesn't update itself automatically. It needs awareness to recognize that the danger it once protected you from is no longer present. That the version of you standing here now is stronger, clearer, and more capable than the one who made the original contract. Right now, simply by recognizing the purpose behind your loop, you are offering your system something it's been waiting for. Reassurance. Reassurance that you no longer need the pattern to keep you safe. Reassurance that you can meet your present reality with more capacity than you once had. Reassurance that expansion is no longer a threat. As this understanding settles in your field, you may feel a gentle release, a loosening in your chest, a softening in your breath, a quiet shift in the way your body holds itself. This is compassion rewriting the contract. This is your nervous system beginning to trust the new space you are stepping into. There is a subtle truth about your emotional world that you may have sensed but never fully understood. The feelings you return to most often aren't just responses to life. They are signals you send into the field. Every repeated emotion emits a frequency, a kind of steady pulse that tells reality who you believe yourself to be. And because the field responds to coherence, it reflects that signal back to you in the form of matching circumstances, matching people, and matching experiences. This is why your loop continued. Not because you chose it consciously, but because familiarity broadcasts loudly. When you feel a particular emotion again and again, your system begins to treat it as home. Even if that emotion is frustration, doubt, or longing, it becomes a stable internal frequency, and the field listens to stability more closely than intensity. So the familiar emotion becomes a quiet magnet, drawing in the kinds of moments that resonate with it. This isn't metaphoric. It's energetic consistency. Your emotional body acts like a transmitter, and reality organizes itself around whatever signal it receives most often. Think of a time when you expected disappointment and somehow it arrived, or when you anticipated being overlooked and the situation unfolded exactly that way. You weren't predicting the future. You were broadcasting the emotional imprint of your past, and because the field experiences your emotion as a kind of instruction, it arranged your timeline accordingly. This is why certain patterns repeated, even when you wanted something different. Your desire wasn't the dominant frequency, your familiarity was. Every emotion has a texture, a shape, a resonance. When that resonance stays consistent, it becomes a loop, not because the universe is against you, but because your internal signal is steady enough to create repetition. The field isn't punishing you, it's matching you. It's echoing your inner world with astonishing accuracy. And once you understand this, you begin to see your past not as fate, but as frequency. This realization is powerful because it shifts the source of your reality from the external world to your internal state. You start noticing which emotions you return to without thinking. You feel which ones arise automatically in moments of change or uncertainty. And as you become aware of these emotional patterns, you begin to see how they sustain the loop far more effectively than any circumstance ever could. But this understanding isn't here to blame you, it's here to free you. Because the moment you see that emotional familiarity sustain the loop, you also see that emotional shifts, even small ones, have the power to disrupt it. You don't need to overhaul your life. You don't need to rewrite every belief. You simply need to shift the frequency you return to most naturally. The loop can't survive in a field that no longer aligns with its signature. If this recognition resonates with you, if you feel something in you softening or awakening, take a moment to like this video. It helps this message reach the people whose patterns are calling to be seen, and it anchors your own shift by affirming the clarity rising within you. You're beginning to see how energy patterns sustain themselves and how you are now stepping beyond them. There comes a moment in every transformational path where something subtle yet unmistakable shifts inside you. Not a dramatic breakthrough, not a sudden surge of power, just a quiet, deliberate pause in a place where you would normally react without thinking. This pause is the fracture point, the moment where the loop begins to lose its authority, because the loop depends on your automatic responses. It relies on you playing the same emotional role over and over again. The moment you interrupt that rhythm, even slightly, the structure begins to weaken. A fracture point can look ordinary from the outside. Maybe someone says something that would usually trigger self-doubt, and instead of collapsing into the familiar emotion, you simply breathe. Maybe an old fear rises, and instead of clinging to it, you observe it with calm curiosity. Maybe you catch yourself about to repeat a familiar pattern, apologizing unnecessarily, shrinking, defending yourself, and you choose not to. These choices may seem small, but they are seismic on the level of identity. Identity fractures occur when you respond in a way that contradicts the version of you the loop expects. The loop knows your old reactions intimately. It anticipates them. It recreates situations to draw them out. When you interrupt the pattern with even a moment of awareness, the loop doesn't know how to complete itself. It stutters. It loses coherence. And in that hesitation, a crack forms in the emotional structure that once felt unbreakable. This is not about forcing yourself to be different. It's not about sudden confidence or extreme discipline. The fracture point happens naturally when your consciousness rises just enough to see the pattern instead of becoming it. That moment of seeing is the beginning of choice. You are no longer fully inside the loop. You are standing at its edge, watching it attempt to pull you back into a role you've already begun outgrowing. What makes the fracture point so powerful is that it doesn't require perfection. You don't need to respond differently every time. You don't need to transform your entire behavior overnight. One genuine interruption is enough to begin unraveling the loop's momentum, because once the system realizes you are capable of a new response, the old identity loses its absolute hold. The loop can't operate with the same certainty it once relied on. You might notice that after a fracture point, the pattern tries to reassert itself. Old thoughts may resurface, familiar emotions may pull at you. But something is different. The pattern no longer feels inevitable. It no longer feels like the only path available. You're aware of the gap between stimulus and response, the gap where choice lives. And that awareness is the beginning of freedom. This is the first true step toward breaking the loop. Not breaking through force, but breaking through divergence, through responding as the version of you your future depends on, rather than the version your past assumed you would always remain. In that single moment of conscious interruption, you create a crack wide enough for an entirely new timeline to begin forming. Quietly, naturally, inevitably. There is a moment right before the loop completes itself where something inside you hesitates. A tiny opening. A space so small you could easily overlook it. But within that space lies the power to change everything. The micro-shift technique begins here, in the space before your automatic reaction takes over. It's not about stopping the emotion. It's not about silencing the thought. It's simply about becoming aware 1 second earlier than you usually would. A micro-shift is quiet. It's subtle. It happens inside your body before anything changes outside of you. It begins with noticing the first spark of the familiar pattern. The tightening in your chest, the familiar thought rising, the instinct to defend, explain, shrink, or rush. In the past, this moment would have gone unnoticed, and the loop would have taken over. But now, instead of slipping into the old rhythm, you pause. Just a breath. Just a soft recognition. This is the pattern trying to run. That recognition is the technique. You don't need to replace the emotion. You don't need to affirm something new. You don't need to force calm or confidence. A micro-shift isn't about overpowering the loop. It's about interrupting its momentum. When you notice the first movement of the pattern and simply witness it, not obey it, the loop can't complete itself. It loses the automatic pathway it depends on. You might feel the old reaction pulling at you. You might hear the familiar thoughts trying to anchor themselves. But something inside you is watching instead of participating. And that shift, that simple act of observation, is enough to create a new trajectory. Awareness reorganizes energy. It changes the frequency you're broadcasting. It changes the emotional signal the field receives. A micro-shift is small internally, but immense energetically. The key is softness. If you try to force a new response, you activate the pattern more strongly. Force belongs to the loop. Awareness breaks it, so when the familiar feeling rises, you meet it gently. You notice how it moves through your body. You feel the impulse without acting on it. You stay present, even for a moment. That presence dissolves the pattern's certainty. In that moment, you might feel a slight expansion. A tiny release, a sense that you're no longer merged with the emotion but observing it from a small distance. This is the micro-shift. This is you reclaiming the space where choice lives. And even though nothing dramatic has happened outwardly, something foundational has shifted inwardly. Over time, these micro-shifts accumulate. The loop begins to anticipate a reaction you're no longer giving it. Its structure weakens because its continuity depends on your unconscious participation. Each time you pause, breathe, and watch instead of react, you are fracturing the old identity the loop tries to reinforce. You don't have to get it perfect. Even one micro-shift is enough to begin unraveling years of repetition. One moment of awareness is enough to redirect the energy that once kept you cycling through the same emotional landscape. You intervene before the pattern completes, not through effort, but through presence. This is how the loop begins to collapse, not with force, not with struggle, but with the smallest, softest, most powerful shift of all, becoming conscious one moment sooner than you ever have before. There is a moment after awareness interrupts the loop where the emotional charge that once fueled the pattern begins to soften. It doesn't vanish instantly. It unwinds. It releases in layers. And as it does, something profound becomes possible. The energy pattern that kept the loop alive begins to dissolve. This is the essence of the energy pattern reset. It's not about replacing the old emotion with a new one. It's about allowing the old emotion to lose its intensity, its authority, its grip on your internal world. Every repeating loop depends on emotional charge. The charge is the electricity that powers the pattern. It's the spark that ignites the same thoughts, the same reactions, the same behaviors. Without that charge, the loop has no momentum. It cannot sustain itself. So when you meet the familiar emotion with presence rather than resistance, the charge begins to weaken. You're no longer feeding it with fear, with avoidance, or with automatic agreement. You're simply witnessing it. And witnessing is what drains the loop of power. Neutrality is the key, not numbness, not indifference. True neutrality, the calm recognition that the emotion is present, but it is not who you are. When you can feel an emotion without collapsing into it, without fighting it, without letting it dictate your identity, the frequency underneath the loop collapses. The emotional field reorganizes itself. The energy that once moved in a closed circle begins to open. This reset feels subtle at first, a sense of spaciousness where tension used to live, a quiet awareness where urgency once took over. You might feel as though the emotion is still there, but it no longer pulls you in the same way. You can look at it without becoming it. This is the sign that the loop is losing its fuel. The old identity that once sustained the pattern no longer matches your internal state. As neutrality expands, the emotional frequency that anchored your past experiences begins to dissolve. It's as if the field around you clears. The old signal stops broadcasting. And when the signal stops, reality stops echoing it back to you. The universe no longer receives the instruction to recreate the same circumstances. The timeline that once felt inevitable begins to unravel, not because you forced it, but because the energy holding it together has been released. This reset creates space for something new to emerge, space for a different identity to express itself, space for a future that doesn't mirror your past. New thoughts begin to appear, not as affirmations, but as natural reflections of a calmer internal landscape. New impulses arise, not from fear or habit, but from clarity. The lack of emotional charge opens a path for new possibilities to enter your field. You don't create a new reality through intensity. You create it through space. Space made by dissolving the old emotional rhythm. Space made by allowing the past to stop repeating inside you. Space made by neutrality. When the charge dissolves, the loop collapses. And when the loop collapses, the future opens. There is a moment after the loop loses its momentum when something subtle yet unmistakable begins to move in your external world. It doesn't wait for you to make a plan. It doesn't wait for you to take action. The shift begins the instant the internal pattern collapses, because reality has been responding to your inner frequency all along, and when that frequency changes, the field reorganizes around it with remarkable speed. What once felt fixed starts to soften. What once felt immovable begins to open. The shift doesn't always arrive with grand signs at first. Often, it begins in the smallest ways. A conversation takes an unexpected turn. A thought you've had for years suddenly feels irrelevant. Something that used to trigger you lands differently, without the same weight. People respond to you with a tone they've never used before. These subtle changes are not coincidences. They are the first external reflections of an internal interruption. When the emotional loop collapses, reality loses its template for recreating the past, and it begins searching for a new, coherent pattern to follow. That search is the shift. You might notice that opportunities you once felt blocked from suddenly feel closer. A sense of possibility rises without effort. You feel drawn to new ideas, new actions, new environments. Not because you're forcing yourself to change, but because your field is now aligned with a different trajectory. This happens because the absence of emotional charge creates a vacuum, and the universe responds by filling that vacuum with the frequency of your new state. The shift doesn't wait for readiness, it responds to alignment. Sometimes the instant shift shows up as a change in timing. Things that used to drag suddenly accelerate. Things that once felt urgent lose their urgency. Plans rearrange themselves, delays resolve. Doors that felt sealed begin to open on their own. You're not imagining this. When the loop collapses, the timeline that depended on it collapses too. The reality built around the old pattern can no longer sustain itself, so it reorganizes to match the identity you're beginning to step into. You may even feel a strange sense that your future is moving toward you more quickly than before. This isn't fantasy, it's coherence. When your internal state no longer contradicts your desires, the field doesn't have to compensate for the conflict. Your energy becomes streamlined, and timelines respond with equal clarity. Possibilities that once felt distant begin to show up in your awareness. Solutions that once felt complex begin to simplify. The shift doesn't create these outcomes, it reveals what was always aligned but inaccessible while the loop held your frequency in place. The most profound part of the instant shift is not the external changes themselves, but the recognition that they are directly tied to your inner transformation. You begin to see the connection between your internal interruption and the external reflection. You see how quickly reality listens. You see that manifestation is not a distant process, but an immediate reorganization of the field when your identity changes. And in that recognition, you understand something essential. Timelines don't move slowly. They move the moment you do. After the loop collapses, reality begins communicating with you in a new language, a language made of echoes, symbols, and subtle alignments. These are the synchronicity aftershocks. They arrive not as random coincidences, but as confirmations from the field that your internal shift has taken effect. Synchronicities are the universe's way of saying, I heard you. I see your new frequency. I'm reorganizing around it. And once you understand how to notice them, you realize they've been speaking to you more clearly than you ever knew. At first, the synchronicities may seem gentle. A thought you're having is mirrored in something you overhear. A message arrives at the exact moment you're contemplating a new direction. You think of someone only for them to reach out minutes later. These alignments don't feel forced. They feel natural, almost inevitable. They carry a quiet harmony that tells you you're no longer moving in circles. You're moving forward. As the new trajectory stabilizes, the synchronicities become more pronounced. You begin noticing repeating numbers, repeating images, repeating themes, not as superstition, but as resonance. The field is responding to your updated signal, arranging reflections around you that match your new identity. These patterns aren't here to predict the future. They're here to show you that the past no longer has the same grip. They're here to anchor the new frequency by mirroring it back to you. You might find yourself encountering opportunities that align too precisely to ignore. Someone mentions the exact idea you've been considering. A path that once felt closed suddenly appears open. The right information reaches you at the exact moment you have the capacity to receive it. These synchronicities aren't accidents. They're feedback. They're the field adjusting itself to support the version of you who emerged when the loop dissolved. Recognizing these signals creates a deeper sense of trust. You begin to understand that you're not navigating your new timeline alone. Consciousness, environment, and possibility are working in tandem. The synchronicities act like markers on a trail, small lights confirming that the path beneath your feet is aligned. What once felt like uncertainty begins to feel like orchestration. Life becomes more fluid, more responsive, more attuned to your internal shifts. The most transformative part is recognizing that synchronicities don't create the shift. They confirm it. They appear because your internal world has changed enough for reality to reflect that change without resistance. They remind you that the timeline you're stepping into is coherent with who you've become, not who you used to be. They remind you that the universe adjusts quickly when your identity does. As you continue noticing these subtle alignments, something deeper opens. You start listening more closely to intuition. You start trusting the gentle nudges that come without explanation. You begin to understand that what you call coincidence is actually communication, the field responding to your presence with clarity. These aftershocks are not signs to interpret or puzzles to solve. They are acknowledgement. They are reflection. They are harmony appearing at the edges of your awareness, showing you that the shift is real, active, and unfolding. And each time you recognize one, the new trajectory stabilizes a little more. When the loop collapses and the old emotional frequency dissolves, something profound becomes possible. You begin to meet yourself without the filter of the past. Not the version of you shaped by survival, not the version conditioned by repetition, but the quieter, truer self that has been waiting beneath the pattern all along. This is the identity you step into. Not because you force it, but because it naturally rises when the old identity loses its hold. Identity is not a performance. It is the internal posture you take toward your own existence. It is the way you interpret yourself before the world interprets you. And for so long, your identity has been informed by the loop. The emotions you repeated, the beliefs you inherited, the expectations you unconsciously carried. When the loop was active, your sense of self was shaped inside its walls. But now those walls are dissolving, and a different self-perception begins to emerge. This shift stabilizes not through effort, but through recognition. You don't become a new version of yourself by trying to be one. You become it by allowing yourself to see who you already are without the weight of the loop. Identity changes when awareness changes, when you realize you are no longer the person who needed the old pattern, when you notice your reactions softening, when you feel the quiet confidence of someone who is no longer defined by yesterday's emotions. You may notice that you respond differently to situations that once triggered the old cycle. You may feel less urgency, less fear, less attachment to outcomes. You may experience moments of clarity where your choices feel guided by something deeper than habit. These aren't coincidences. They are reflections of your evolving identity. Your inner architecture is rebuilding itself around a frequency of coherence rather than survival. This new identity isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with grand declarations. It arrives softly, in the way you breathe through moments that once overwhelmed you, in the way you hold yourself when facing uncertainty, in the way you inhabit your own presence with more ease than before. These subtle shifts are the foundation of the new reality forming around you, because identity is the blueprint, reality is the structure built upon it. As you recognize this emerging version of yourself, the integration begins. You start aligning your choices with who you are becoming rather than who you were. You stop rehearsing old narratives. You stop explaining yourself in ways that belong to an earlier chapter. You begin living in a way that honors the clarity rising within you. This recognition is what stabilizes the shift. It grounds the new timeline. It anchors the expanded frequency. You don't have to rush this process. Identity evolves naturally when the loop dissolves. The more you recognize the subtle ways you've already changed, the more the field organizes itself around this new coherence. Your reality doesn't need you to force anything. It only needs you to acknowledge who you are now. A self no longer shaped by the past, but emerging from the space the past left behind. This recognition is the beginning of your new world taking form. When you begin to inhabit a new frequency, there is a period where everything feels unfamiliar, not wrong, not dangerous, simply new. And because your nervous system has spent years, sometimes decades, operating inside the emotional rhythm of the old loop, stepping into a fresh timeline can create sensations that feel uncomfortable at first. This discomfort isn't a sign that you're slipping backward. It's evidence that your system is stretching into a reality it has never had the space to experience before. The old frequency may not have been pleasant, but it was known. It had edges your body understood. It carried emotions your mind could predict. Even the pain was familiar enough to feel manageable. When you rise into a new timeline, the nervous system momentarily loses its orientation. The patterns it once relied on no longer apply. The emotional cues it once anticipated no longer appear. And without those signals, your system pauses, unsure of how to move in this new landscape. This pause can feel like restlessness. It can feel like an odd emptiness, as if something is missing. It can even feel like vulnerability, because the protective layers built by the loop no longer fit. You may notice moments where small things feel amplified, or where your reactions feel slower, or where clarity comes in waves rather than all at once. None of this means you're doing anything wrong. It means your internal world is recalibrating to match a frequency that once felt out of reach. Growth rarely feels like expansion at first. It often feels like instability. Imagine stepping onto a new floor after standing on the same ground for years. Your balance wavers not because the floor is unsteady, but because you are adjusting to its newness. This is what happens inside you. Your nervous system is learning to trust a reality that isn't built on fear, repetition, or emotional survival. It's learning to breathe without bracing. You may also notice that your mind tries to recreate old worries simply because it doesn't know what to do with the silence left behind. This isn't regression, it's habit. Patterns echo even after they dissolve. But the difference now is that the echo doesn't pull you into the full loop. It fades. It loses intensity. It passes through you instead of anchoring you. This is the sign that the new frequency is taking hold. As the days pass, the unfamiliar becomes less intimidating. Your nervous system begins to stabilize. It learns the contours of this new timeline, the softness, the spaciousness, the absence of old emotional noise. What once felt unsettling begins to feel natural. What once felt uncertain begins to feel supportive. Your system learns that this new reality is not a threat, but a home. So if you feel moments of unease, don't interpret them as signs of misalignment. They are the tremors of transformation. They are your body and mind expanding into a version of you they were not previously calibrated to hold. This discomfort is not resistance, it is adaptation. You are growing into a frequency that matches who you've become, not who you once were. And the unease you feel now is simply the echo of a past identity making room for the future that is already here. When a new timeline begins to form around you, the old loop doesn't disappear immediately. It lingers at the edges, not because it still has power, but because it's familiar. Patterns don't cling out of strength, they cling out of habit. And so the key to staying out of the old loop is not force, not vigilance, not self-correction. It is simplicity, it is awareness, it is coherence. These are the qualities that keep you aligned with the version of yourself the shift revealed. The old loop may attempt to reattach through familiar thoughts, familiar emotional pulls, or familiar impulses to shrink or explain yourself. But you'll notice something important. These echoes feel different now. They feel thinner, less convincing, almost like memories trying to masquerade as the present. That difference is your advantage. It means you can see the pattern before you act from it. And that seeing is what prevents reattachment. Staying out of the loop begins with recognizing that you don't need to fight the old impulses. The moment you resist them, you energize them. Instead, you meet them with calm acknowledgement. When an old emotion rises, you observe it the way you'd observe a cloud passing overhead, present but not permanent. When an old thought appears, you notice its texture without engaging its story. When an old reaction tries to activate, you recognize it as a path you've already stepped off of. Awareness keeps you free because awareness refuses to merge with the past. Simplicity is the next key. You don't need new rituals, new systems, or new strategies to stay aligned. Complexity belongs to the loop. It thrives on overthinking. Your new timeline stabilizes through ease, through choosing the smallest action that matches the person you are becoming, through taking the gentlest breath before responding, through letting clarity rise on its own instead of chasing it. Simplicity is coherence in motion. It prevents you from slipping into the noise of the old identity. Coherence itself is the final anchor. Coherence means your mind, body, and energy are moving in the same direction. It means you behave in ways that support your new frequency instead of contradicting it. You hold yourself differently. You speak from truth rather than fear. You make choices that feel clean in your system. When you are coherent, the old loop cannot reattach because there is no fragmented place for it to land. If you ever sense the old pattern trying to pull you back, you don't fight it. You don't panic. You simply return to this truth. The loop can only survive if you feed it, and you are no longer the version of you who does. Each time you choose presence over autopilot, each time you choose clarity over habit, each time you choose alignment over familiarity, the old timeline dissolves a little more. In this space, as you stand between who you were and who you are becoming, I want to invite you to comment below. Share the pattern you've noticed loosening, or the moment you felt the shift begin. Speaking it aloud anchors it more deeply, and it helps others recognize their own unfolding. There comes a point in every shift where the new identity needs something simple, something steady, something repeatable to help it settle into your field. Not a complicated routine, not an intense practice, just a gentle ritual that reminds your nervous system that the new timeline is safe to inhabit. This is the coherence ritual. Its purpose isn't to force transformation, but to create a rhythm your system can trust as it adjusts to the new frequency you've stepped into. The ritual begins with presence. Find a moment in your day, morning, evening, or any quiet pause, where you can sit without interruption. You don't need special music or a particular posture. You only need to meet yourself. Close your eyes or soften your gaze and feel your breath as it moves through you. Not deep breaths, natural breaths. Breaths that match where you already are. This is how you tell your system, nothing needs to be different for me to be here. Next, let your attention rest gently in the center of your chest. Not to search for anything, not to summon anything, simply to occupy the space where your emotional field lives. As you place awareness there, you may feel warmth or openness or nothing at all. All of it is perfect. Coherence doesn't come from sensation, it comes from attention. When your awareness holds a single point without rushing to the next thought, your energy begins to organize itself. Then, without forcing a new feeling, recall the subtle shifts you've already noticed in yourself. The moment you responded differently than you used to. The moment you felt space instead of urgency. The moment clarity appeared where confusion once lived. These aren't memories. They are anchors. Bring one of these moments into your awareness, not to analyze it, but to acknowledge it. This simple recognition aligns your identity with the path you are now walking. As you hold that recognition, let your breath move slowly through it. Imagine the moment settling into your chest like a quiet truth. You're not trying to recreate the feeling. You're allowing your system to register. This is who I am now. Your energy begins to match the memory of your evolution, anchoring it more deeply each time you revisit it with presence. Finally, place one hand on your chest or your abdomen. This is the signal your nervous system understands most clearly, a physical gesture that communicates safety and grounding. Stay here for a few breaths. Feel your own touch as a reminder that the self you are becoming is real, stable, and embodied. This is coherence. You are teaching your system that the new identity isn't a concept. It is lived. The ritual doesn't need to last long. A minute is enough. 5 minutes is a gift. What matters is consistency, not duration. Each time you return to this simple practice, you reinforce the frequency of your new timeline and quiet the echoes of the old one. You create an energetic pathway your system can trust. And with trust comes continuity. With continuity comes stability. With stability comes the reality that matches who you have already become. There is a moment in every transformation where recognition becomes creation. Not because you're forcing a new reality into place, but because you are finally willing to acknowledge the truth of who you have become. This final declaration is not a performance. It is not motivation. It is not an affirmation meant to convince you. It is a quiet claiming of the frequency you now hold. By speaking it within yourself, you allow reality to reorganize around your new identity with clarity and permanence. You've moved through the loop, you've felt the fractures, you've witnessed the micro-shifts, the dissolving charge, the instant realignments, the synchronicity that followed. You've stepped into a new identity and navigated the unfamiliar edges of a new frequency. Now the shift asks for one final step: recognition. The transformation becomes stable only when you see yourself without the lens of who you used to be, when you stop comparing the present to the past, when you consciously acknowledge that you are no longer living inside the old pattern's gravity. The final declaration is simple, but its power comes from the sincerity behind it. Sit with yourself for a moment. Feel the quiet expansion inside your chest. Feel the spaciousness where the loop once lived. Feel the steadiness that has taken its place. From here, the declaration emerges naturally. It may sound like, "I am no longer who I was," or "the loop has ended," or "my reality now reflects who I truly am." The words are not what matter. What matters is that they arise from a place of truth rather than effort. When you speak this inner recognition, your timeline solidifies. Reality responds to identity, and identity responds to acknowledgement. By declaring that the shift has already happened, you remove the gap between who you are and who you believe yourself to be. You stop waiting for external validation. You stop searching for proof. You become the proof. This is the moment where the field receives a clear, coherent signal, one that replaces the old frequency entirely. You might notice a stillness after making this declaration, a quiet settling, as if something inside you has clicked into place. This stillness is the signature of alignment. It's the sensation of a timeline locking in. It's the resonance that appears when your inner state and your outer field match each other without contradiction. The loop cannot return in this state because there is no version of you left for it to attach to. As you hold this recognition, you may feel a soft gratitude rising, not for anything external, but for the clarity you now inhabit. The gratitude itself is part of the sealing. It marks the moment when your transformation stops being something you're working toward and becomes something you're living from. The declaration becomes a doorway, and once you walk through it, the old reality loses its relevance. This is the closing of the journey, the point where remembering becomes embodiment, the moment where what once felt like a shift becomes your new baseline. And as you stand here, anchored in this expanded identity, you can feel it clearly. The transformation is no longer unfolding. It is complete.